Welcome to This Explainer. I am so glad you're joining us today because we're unpacking a story that is deeply human, historically profound, and honestly, it's just astonishing. Today, we're looking at a dark, totally hidden chapter of military history where tens of thousands of U.S. troops literally became secret chemical test subjects during World War II. We're going straight to the source material here: declassified military documents, a landmark 1993 Institute of Medicine report, and a really detailed NPR investigation to show you exactly what happened, the biological science behind it, and the absolute decades of silence that followed. To really wrap our heads around the reality of these tests, we have to listen to the men who actually lived through them. Rollins Edwards, a World War II veteran, recalled it like this: "It felt like you were on fire. Guys started screaming and hollering and trying to break out." I mean, just imagine that. That's the harrowing memory of a young African-American soldier who, along with a dozen others, was led into a wooden gas chamber and locked inside by his own commanding officers right before a mixture of mustard gas and lewisite was piped in. And the sheer scale of this whole operation is just staggering. The Department of Defense enrolled 60,000 enlisted men for these highly classified chemical trials. Now, I have to put volunteer in heavy air quotes here, right? Because, as the sources point out, for a young soldier in the 1940s, looking your commanding officer in the eye and refusing an assignment it was basically unthinkable. So, let's get into how the military actually pulled this off. Section 1. Categorizing the tests. 3 methods of exposure. The military's testing essentially fell into 3 main buckets. First, you had patch tests. This meant applying drops of liquid agent directly onto the skin, and the vast majority of those 60,000 men experienced these somewhat milder exposures. Second, we've got field tests, where subjects were sent outdoors in simulated combat scenarios, right over contaminated ground. And third, the chamber tests, where men were locked inside physical gas chambers. Documentation shows that about 4,000 soldiers had to endure these incredibly severe full-body field and chamber exposures. Which brings us to Section 2, testing troops by race, the search for the ideal chemical soldier. Now, what's really interesting about this NPR investigation is that it revealed the testing was strictly categorized by race. White enlisted men were used as the scientific control group, so their physical reactions were recorded just to establish a baseline for what the military considered a normal reaction to the chemicals. On the flip side, African American, Japanese American, and Puerto Rican troops were specifically sought out to be the test groups. Basically, the military was hunting for this idea of an ideal chemical soldier. They wanted to see, for example, if the skin of Black and Puerto Rican soldiers was somehow more resistant to chemical burns. The thought process was, if they are, we can put them on the front lines while the white soldiers stay back. And on top of that, Japanese American troops were actively used as proxies for the enemy, letting scientists figure out exactly how these weapons might impact Japanese troops over in the Pacific. And this really starkly illustrates the brutal reality of those field tests, coming straight from the memory of Juan Lopez Negron, who was a Puerto Rican soldier. He was part of the San Jose Project, which was a series of over 100 experiments on a Panamanian island picked specifically for its Pacific-like climate. Negron and other guys were sent deep into the jungle and just bombarded with mustard gas, sprayed from U.S. military planes flying right overhead. He remembers, "We had uniforms on to protect ourselves, but the animals didn't. They were rabbits. They all died." Negron ended up spending 3 weeks in the hospital with a severe fever right after that. Okay, let's shift gears a bit and dive into Section 3, the biological damage, down to the DNA. We need to look at exactly what these chemicals were doing to the soldiers' bodies on a microscopic level. To fully grasp the severity of these injuries, we're looking at the rigorous science from the 1993 Institute of Medicine report and NCBI data. Mustard gas and lewisite act as what scientists call monofunctional and bifunctional DNA alkylating agents. It sounds like a mouthful, but in plain English, DNA alkylation is a process where these chemical agents literally alter a cell's genetic memory. They form these crosslinks that bind adjacent strands of DNA together. It's a reaction that is incredibly lethal to cells, and it's a primary driver for cellular mutation and cancer down the road. And physically, the damage was just agonizing. Why? Well, because the chemical reaction of mustard gas is heavily accelerated by heat and moisture. Think about it. When you've got soldiers sweating in a tropical jungle field test or locked inside a stuffy wooden gas chamber, their own body heat and sweat completely amplified those chemical burns. The warm, humid areas of the body, specifically the mucous membranes and the groin area, were highly, highly vulnerable. The actual explicit scientific endpoint of these tests was tissue injury. They were looking for severe erythema, which is extreme skin reddening, and chemical burns so terrible that the skin would literally rot and peel off in large flakes. So let's see how that acute trauma translates into a lifetime of suffering in Section 4, Chronic Illness and the Long-Term Devastation. Going from those immediate injuries, which, by the way, often meant a month or more stuck in the hospital, to the lifelong devastation was a grim reality. The Institute of Medicine went through nearly 2,000 scientific papers and found definitive causal links between these exposures and a whole host of chronic illnesses. Physically, that DNA alkylation we just talked about, it led to massive spikes in respiratory cancers, leukemia, and chronic conjunctivitis. Plus, those severe chemical burns to the highly vulnerable groin area caused heavy scrotal scarring, which meant chronic, lifelong sexual dysfunction for a lot of these men. And psychologically, the sheer terror of being locked in a gas chamber, totally unable to escape while guys are literally fainting around you, resulted in severe PTSD, anxiety, and massive mood disorders. So, what happened to these men after the experiments were finally over? That brings us to Section 5, Decades of Silence, the cover-up. Here is the truly stark, objective fact of the matter. Despite suffering from these severe, acute chemical burns, zero long-term medical monitoring or follow-up care was provided to the human subjects. None. The Institute of Medicine actually called it a well-ingrained pattern of abuse and neglect. These guys were simply released on leave, sometimes with active blisters still on their bodies, with absolutely no instructions on how to get care. And making matters infinitely worse, because the whole program was so highly classified, the exposures were never even recorded in their official military files. Let's just trace this timeline of silence for a second. Back in the 1940s, the experiments happened, and the soldiers were sworn to secrecy. Actually, forced is a better word, right under the very real threat of military prison and dishonorable discharge. Because of that threat, these men couldn't even tell their own private doctors why they were suffering. That truth stayed buried for 50 years. It wasn't until 1991 that the Department of Defense finally publicly admitted to the human testing. The secrecy oaths were officially lifted in the early 90s, and then in 1993, that massive Veterans at Risk report was declassified, finally bringing the whole truth to light. Fast forward to today, and the VA finally recognizes the science. If a veteran can prove they had full-body exposure, the VA now grants service connection by presumption for specific disabilities. We're talking about chronic conjunctivitis, acute non-lymphocytic leukemia, various respiratory cancers like lung and laryngeal cancer, and conditions like emphysema and COPD. Every single one of these traces directly back to that cellular DNA damage and the violent respiratory trauma they endured in those chambers and fields. Which leaves us with a pretty profound question, perfectly echoing the words of Representative Barbara Lee when she first reviewed these findings. How do we repay a debt hidden for 50 years? Think about it. These men, completely driven by duty and patriotism, were used as secret test subjects, categorized by race, physically and psychologically damaged, and then just silenced for a half-century. It's a pretty stark reminder of the human cost that often gets hidden in the margins of our history books. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope it gave you a clear, structured understanding of what is undeniably a complex and heavy topic. Keep asking questions, keep looking at the data, and I'll catch you next time.